Hey, welcome back to the channel. This video is a different kind of video. It's different because the person I speak with is internationally known. She's known for being someone that was abused by a Goliath of Hollywood. Now we know him as just an abuser. Thanks for coming here.
Yes.
I thought it would be a really good opportunity for us just to talk kind of for a separate and specific video.
Yeah.
Just to encourage people, really.
Yeah.
While we were talking previously, I thought it would be great just to focus in on what is it you would say to people that have been through stuff that feel alone at the moment. I had some maybe technical things I'll need to look, and in some respects, rather than think, oh, I'll just try and figure it out in the edit, it encouraged me to think, well, what would it be that I could get some time with you now before you go, just to kind of speak about. So there will be some people that watch this video that might not watch the other ones.
Right.
So I'd love to then to look through the background of of over 20 years ago with Weinstein, your experience with him, your process of faith, and where was God through this? Yeah. I think is the kind of question I want to ask. And then finally, what is it that you want to say to whistleblowers, to people that, though they don't necessarily have the strength, why they should? That's my hope in this conversation. So asking the first question, can you tell me a little bit about the Rowena at university, at a fancy university? What was it that you aspired to do?
Yeah, that takes me back. So I read English at Oxford, but I will say it was a real fight. I did go to a very posh private school. So I was at the Abbey School Reading, which prides itself on being Jane Austen's school originally, and they make a lot of that, of course. But of course, it was an incredibly snobby place. And when I grew up there in the 1980s, there were hardly any people of colour at school. I remember I started at this private school at the age of 9, and I was sort of plucked out of my local state school to go to this, school that to me felt a million miles away. In reality, it was only 20 miles from my parents, but for a small 9-year-old, that felt like a huge distance to travel to go to school. But I think more than just the physical distance, the cultural and social distance of going to the school was, to me, unimaginable, having grown up with immigrant parents. I didn't write with a fountain pen. I didn't know who Oscar Wilde was, and I'd never been to an opera. And that horrified the people I went to school with. They were only 9 themselves. So as you can imagine, it was a completely different system. We talked a little bit about the class system. I did stay at that school for an incredible amount of time. I started at 9 and I left at 18. That's 9 years, half my life, basically, at that school. And when it came time to apply for university, I was told in no uncertain terms that there was no way they would support an application to study English because, of course, I didn't grow up steeped in their culture and I would never have an appreciation of their literature. So I was banned from applying for English. For some reason, it was okay for me to study history, but not okay for me to study English. So I've never really understood how I can not be steeped in the literature of the country I grew up in, but not the history. That seems like a little bit...
ironic.
Absolutely ironic.
Yeah.
So anyway, and this is the kind of early seeds of being a fighter. I was supported by the head of history, so I did apply for history, and I got in for history, and I did history mods, and then fought really hard to switch to English finals. And right from the day I first went up to college, I asked to switch over, and it was very difficult to do. Actually, I was at Oxford's smallest college, Corpus Christi College, and it only took 6 history students and 6 English students. So it was actually a huge fight to be allowed to switch over. But I think these were early seeds of my fighting for something that, things, if you're an immigrant, things don't come easy. And you either lie back and take it or you try and fight. And I think one thing that immigrants have going for them, even though they don't have power and things don't come easily, is you're willing to work very hard for something you want. And that's often a sort of thread through immigrant experiences. And so because I really wanted to move to English, I fought really hard for this. And you asked me, what did I want when I was in university? I really wanted to tell stories. And I didn't feel that my stories were in any way valid. I'd been told that my immigrant experience was not anything anyone was interested in. And so when I went and worked around the back of a theatre or in film, which I eventually ended up in film and theatre, I believed that I was only good for telling other people's stories. And I know you'll relate to this because you've done camera work. But I thought that I was only enough for behind the camera work. I never thought I would be in front of a camera or I'd tell my own story about life, which is very ironic given what's happened with the Me Too movement. But certainly when I was at college, it was all about writing other people's stories. It was all about directing other people's stories. It was all about producing other people's stories. And in fact, I did very little direction because I didn't believe in my own vision. I believed that I was the practical servant immigrant and I would make other people's dreams and stories come to life. But even though I took this backstage role, I really believed in the power of story, both in terms of my degree, reading all these classical literature works and thinking about the stories of those that had gone before us, and also in terms of my so-called hobby, which was really to be around the back of a theatre or around the back of a film camera at all times. The main thread of that was telling stories. And I would say my life's journey has moved from thinking that I should tell other people's stories to eventually, in my 40s, so much further down the line, learning how to tell my own story.
So that sense of being a producer or a production assistant, that's what then got you to Hollywood, was it? Was it that was the step?
Well, when I first left Oxford, it was 96, and I very much carried this weight of, whilst I had been to Oxford with people like Amelia Fox and Orlando Welles, if essentially British theatre royalty, I didn't feel that it was a world that I myself had the right to step into. And I think that both a sense of my own inferiority, cultural inferiority, and a sense of wanting to discover myself drove me to go work in film and television in Asia. So that's what I did. I was very naive about that and thought, I'll fit right in because, I'm not really British because I couldn't study English at Oxford. But hey, I'm really Chinese. Of course, I went out there, as all immigrants do, and discovered I wasn't really Chinese at all. But anyway, I went out to Asia to work, and I worked in theatre and film in both Hong Kong, which is very vibrant with many films being made, mostly kung fu films, but other films also, and in Singapore, where I was lucky enough to, work on very classic TV shows like Under One Roof, Three Rooms, which were the Singapore equivalent of Friends for their television channel, Television Corporation Singapore, TCS. So I got to do, and I got to work on a lot of theatre shows. So I did have a fabulous time in Asia, but I am at the end of the day a child of immigrant parents, and they thought I should come home and do something really sensible with my life. So like all good English literature grads, I came home, I enrolled, I was very well behaved, I enrolled in a law conversion course, you can see the eye rolling, and I actually went to work at ICM originally, International Creative Management, in their London office, which at the time was headed up by Duncan Heath. And I think the theme of sort of inferiority continues because my original job that I applied for at ICM was to walk Duncan Heath's dogs. So I was literally going to be the third assistant, and I would walk his two dogs that came with him to the office every day, and I'd go and pick up the laundry and pick up the dry cleaning. And I didn't see anything wrong with a recent Oxford grad walking two dogs, which I think actually tells you something about the way Hollywood is structured. Like Hollywood, it's like a hazing process. You come in, and any sense of who you are and what you know is immediately stripped away because you do the lowest of the low, and it's almost like people are laughing at you because how many terrible things can they get you to do before you'll give up? And those that don't give up slowly rise through the system. And that is exactly the way Hollywood works. Everybody starts as an assistant, and everybody has to shovel the crap before you actually get into a higher position. So I started at ICM, and then an email went round from Zelda Perkins, actually, who was the current assistant of Harvey Weinstein, saying she was looking to leave and she would like someone to come on as Harvey's second assistant so she can train them to take on her job. So it was a very Devil Wears Prada meets role. Anna Wintour had nothing on Harvey Weinstein. I was a second assistant being trained by this fearsome first assistant, and I wanted to be her, and I never thought I could do her job. So I found the whole thing incredibly intimidating. I will also say that when I first joined Miramax, I looked around the room and I saw an entire cast of leggy blonde women from Oxbridge, And I had a massive inferiority complex. I thought, wow, well, I'm not well spoken from a great, lovely home, and I don't have long blonde hair, legs that go on for miles. I definitely don't belong in this environment. So I think there was very much a sense of fear, really, and a sense that if I gave up this opportunity, I would never get another one like it. And that is, of course, what keeps you there through all of the abuse and the, this idea, we touched upon this idea that at work you are constantly told, well, you can give up today and we will have, 20 Harvard Business School grads at your job doing your job within the hour. That sort of sense of your very existence, and at that time your livelihood is incredibly precarious. When I went to the kitchen, I was really worried that I was going to leave a door open and they were all going to wander through. So there we go. It's hilarious. It's all part of the comic effect. We're just talking about walking dogs, actually.
Yeah,
the irony. My
my
letter at ICM said I wanted to be a dog's body. And I think that's really interesting from a psychological point of view.
Yeah.
That's really, I didn't really greatly value myself.
No. Yeah, and I think a lot of us can echo that. Though I went straight into church work, I thought it was going to be telly. I turned that down because I thought my calling was the church.
Yeah.
I was ready to do anything. I was ready to serve in any kind of way, because what an opportunity I've got here, because so many others would want it too.
Yeah, right. And
so,
in the church in particular, that idea of feet washing and being the humble servant leader is very much imbued in you. And unfortunately, it is somewhat hypocritical because a lot of leadership actually don't have a servant mentality. What they really mean is the underlings get the servant mentality. So, that sort of enforces this idea of hierarchy and that some are better than others. And so I always see this idea of my wanting to work at a top Hollywood agency and applying for this job of being a dog's body, and even using that as the sort of cover letter to my application to be a sort of feet washing thing. You asked me earlier where my faith played into coming to Hollywood, and I thought rather naively at the time that I could invert Hollywood culture. I thought I could be the hardworking, feet washing immigrant that served others, and of course there's a very immigrant mentality, and eventually somebody would notice me and I would go somewhere. And I think that is a form that of belief that's very self-crippling, right? You become complicit in your own servitude.
How then did you move from that kind of environment to into Miramax? Tell me a little bit about that kind of move. How presumably you'd felt like, right, this is a good opportunity now.
Yeah, and I seized it with both hands. Now, I think what's very interesting is, of course, I was famously now, as is now known, I was 24 at the time of the assault, but now I'm 52, and I can look through the lens of someone who has been through many different industries and done lots of things, and think, wow, at the time, Harvey's current assistant, which at the time was Zelda, wanted to get someone from an agency like ICM, where famously a call came in every 7 seconds. So it was a very fast-paced environment where the assistants themselves took a lot of abuse because she was at least subconsciously aware that assistants survived a culture where a phone call came into the switchboard every 7 seconds, and it was a very fast-paced and toxic culture, would survive Miramax. They had the best chance of surviving Miramax. And I think it really was a hazing process. We hear about the hazing processes of frat houses where you have to, they dunk new members down, heads down toilets, and you have to try not to drown. It was a sort of very similar thing. There was a sort of belief that if you could survive 2 years as an assistant, either at a top Hollywood agency or at a really frenetic, fast-paced industry like Miramax, that you would then, that was the kind of person that would survive the film industry. So it made sense to sort of be an assistant at ICM and then slide over and be an assistant at Harvey, to Harvey, in Harvey's office, because to some extent I sort of had already proved my ability to take abuse really at ICM, so it was expected that I would take abuse at Miramax.
And that isn't, and that's universal across all the film and TV.
Yeah, pretty much.
Documentary.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah,
I'm sure that's true.
Yeah, you work as the assistant, you do all of it, and then you'll be called for the next job.
Yeah, right. Which is, I mean, The Devil Wears Prada made that apparent, and I really think, my experience in film was The Devil Wears Prada for Hollywood. But that whole idea of like when you're the smallest person on the totem pole, you really get beaten up, and then if you survive it, you can go on to do great things. And there's always the promise of if you survive this, you'll go on to do great things.
So when did being the dog's body turn into becoming a victim?
Well, I was an assistant at ICM. I then became an assistant at Miramax. I just became an assistant to a bigger person. So I was an assistant for a Hollywood agent who were themselves a pretty big deal. And then I went on to be an assistant for Harvey Weinstein. And when did that turn into being a sexual assault survivor? Pretty much the first time Harvey was alone with me. I'm looking back, I am be surprised if Harvey didn't try it on with every woman who he was alone in a room with.
And he was always creating an opportunity to be alone with a woman.
One of the stipulations in our NDA, what is very rarely spoken about, is that Zelda and I argued extremely hard. We talk a lot about the clauses of the NDA that oppressed us. And we attempted to put clauses in the NDA that would hold Harvey accountable. So one of the things that Zelda pushed really hard for, which she'd worked with him for 4 years and saw much better, had much better idea, and in some ways knew the devil far better than I did, she insisted that he either have only male assistants going forward, or he would have 3 female assistants on rotation. Now, publicly, I've spoken about how our days are structured. When Harvey travelled, he barely slept, like many men of power. Zelda would have to go in and wake him up at 6, and she did that early shift for 4 hours by herself from 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. And I didn't come on duty until 10 a.m. You can only imagine what took place between 6 a.m. and 10 a.m. And then the office would formally open at 10, and there'd be a whole string of people coming to meet with him. You've been in the industry, you would know. There'll be producers, directors, actors, money people, all sorts of people. A whole string of people from 10 until 10 o'clock at night, really. There's lunches, there's teas, there's award ceremonies in the evening, there's gala screenings of movies, the whole works, especially if you're at a film festival. So really from 10 to 10, that's the busy period. So both Zelda and I are on from 10 to 10, but she did this morning shift for 4 hours, getting me out of bed at 6 and holding the fort until I got there at 10. And I did a late night shift from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. So people think when I was in the hotel room, back to this idea of allegations, what were you wearing, what were you doing? Well, if you were in Harvey's hotel room at 12, you were obviously asking for it. Well, they didn't, we'd have to explain as assistants, no, that's part of our working day. I'd work a 12-hour shift with Zelda side by side, and then I would also do a 4-hour shift at night by myself. And that was intended to be when Harvey and Zelda left the room at 8 p.m. to go to whatever dinner, award ceremony, gala that they were attending, I would be given a stack of scripts, 10, 15, 20 scripts, and I would have to read them in the 4 hours they were out between, or the couple of hours they were out between, I don't know, say 6 in the evening to 10. And then when I did my own shift at 10, when Zelda went off to her room to rest, because she had to start again at 6 in the morning, I would be expected to discuss those scripts. They would be a script meeting. But of course, with Harvey Weinstein, the line between professional and personal blurs really fast.
And you'd been prepared to be the dog's body.
I think it's kind of wild. You've got to remember this was 1998.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of wild in 98 what women were expected to put up with. And I don't mean just women that worked for Harvey Weinstein. I mean far more across the film industry, but certainly across other industries. So it was made clear in the interview that he was a handsy guy. And you'd be told things by other assistants like, well, wear 2 pairs of tights, put on an extra jacket, never be sitting on the couch right next to him. But notice that the onus is on the young woman who has no name and no money or anything to speak of to be the one to protect herself. It's your fault if you get assaulted. So make sure you are properly dressed. Make sure you never do anything to encourage him. You're in
because
the
it's
room.
Only him. That's the line I've heard
We're
about.
managing around Harvey.
Yeah.
We're not there's nothing about Harvey's wrong here and he should like control himself. No, we're managing around Harvey because his peace can't possibly be disturbed. Yeah. It's our responsibility to make him comfortable, and therefore our sense of personal safety is only for us to manage. So you're talking about a work environment where if you complain about your boss, you're told things like, oh, he didn't mean it, or you misunderstood, or are you sure he didn't just brush past you? But then at the same time, you know, you're told if anything happens to you, it's entirely your fault. I mean, there's a whole system of double standards and crisscrossing where the blame is never laid at the door of the person who's the CEO of the company, or the male, or the rich, or the white, or the, you know, all systems of power person. Instead, it's the young woman who's a person of colour who's unpaid or making, you know, peanuts, that they have to take the responsibility. And I think that's kind of wild. So I often look back on, you know, now we're living in a post-Me Too era where we've got words like sexual assault. I remember in 98, we didn't even have language for that.
No.
Harvey tried to sleep with me. Does holding me down and separating my legs, could that be described as he tried to sleep with me? And yet it was. You know, if he grabs you and tries to put his hand on your bum or put his hand down your cleavage, he's handsy. I just feel like the number of euphemisms used in the 1980s to describe essentially criminal behaviour were in themselves shocking. It's very much a minimisation of female experience by saying, oh, he's a little bit handsy. You've got to watch out for that one. He's a little bit handsy.
When did that experience turn into, this needs to be spoken about? I need to speak out about this. And you've said you initially spoke about it anonymously. Yeah. But and I want us to keep this fairly contained because I know you've got to go as well. But when someone's experienced something and when someone's experienced something that they know they've been taken advantage of, they've been abused, when does that experience need to move from I've experienced this to I need to speak out about it?
I will say that for me personally, it was extremely slow. So what I want to share with your viewers is that everyone's journey to really a full realisation of what's happened to them. So let's go right back, because I think many survivors of a sexual assault actually don't know to call it that. They don't quite, I mean, you're initially in shock. You don't quite know what's happened to you. And whilst the world outside is minimising it by saying he didn't mean it, or he brushed past you too close, or you're imagining things, you second guess yourself to say, did that really happen? Did I just imagine it? Maybe he just got carried away. You know, there are all sorts of lies that you might tell yourself to minimise your own experience. So I think step one is, can you to yourself in the secret of your own room late at night actually call it a sexual assault? I don't know. Like, when do you get to the point where you realise what's happened to you is not right and it can be something that you might do something about? But just acknowledging it to yourself first is really difficult. And then I would say the second step, so believing yourself, I think, is a number one kind of step. And actually, a lot of sexual assault survivors don't even reach that first fundamental step. Then your second fundamental step is, who do you think is going to believe you? And often the answer to that is surprising, tragically. It's not your parent. It's not your sibling. It's not your closest best friend. It's not your work wife. These people often don't believe you. So can you find a trusted person to tell who will believe you? And then beyond that, there is all sorts of other circles, wider circles, right? If it's a famous person, possibly the media. Even if it's not a famous person, possibly the legal industry, but the framework of legality. But that's, again, very complicated and will take a very long time. If it's criminal, sufficiently criminal, are you going to tell the police? So there's sorts of concentric outgoing circles. But I would say the very fundamental kernel is, do you believe yourself? Often people don't. So for me personally, all those different steps took a very long time. Now, what's very interesting, we've discussed this in the context of the Me Too movement, is I think this is particularly true for women. If you will not do it for yourself, will you do it for someone else? And I think women, perhaps more than men, are often driven to think about the wider context. You can argue it's biological because women are conditioned to perpetuate the human race, to be maternal, to have to consider beyond oneself. So there are lots of sort of biological, psychological arguments around that. But I think it's often easier to act on behalf of someone else. So then what happened in practice is I went to Zelda the following day to tell her that this is what happened in the hotel room the night before. Now, psychologically, that whole setup is very interesting because the reason why I went to Zelda is I wasn't, in fact, asking for her to blow this open and for us to go to the police. I was actually asking, the subtext of what I was asking is, hey, how does one survive this? I didn't even think of giving up the job or anything like that. I just thought, well, there's lots of, as I aforementioned, beautiful, leggy, blonde-haired, blue-eyed women who were very smart, from lovely middle-class homes, with wonderful degrees from Oxford and Cambridge. And they were all working for Harvey. So I'm sure they didn't turn up to work and get raped every day. So how does one survive this? What does one do? And I thought the answer might be, well, instead of 2 pairs of tights, wear 3. I mean, this sounds ludicrous to say this, but, you know, I had been given advice. The advice didn't work. So what was the magic formula? What did I have to say to stop this from happening? So that was really why I went to Zelda. Because it's funny how that's lost in the midst of time. And now we have this hero narrative where I went weeping to Zelda and we immediately quit our jobs. And of course the movie makes it out to be like that because ironically the Hollywood movie of a Hollywood movie, has diluted and Hollywoodized that whole experience. But that whole experience was in fact very human. I didn't want to lose that job. For what we've mentioned, I thought I was lucky to be there. I thought I'd never get that opportunity again. I thought they would have another 20 leggy blonde ladies from elite model management at my desk willing to take my job if I gave it up. So I went to Zelda because I thought there was a way of surviving it. Now, interestingly, from Zelda's point of view, and I have spoken about this publicly, so I can speak about it in this interview, she'd been working for Harvey for 4 years and she was pretty fed up. She knew his ways. And she said, don't mess with the next one. What can I do to get you not to mess with the next one? And he said, well, I don't do Jews or Chinese. That's what he said, which was pretty disgusting. By the way, he is himself Jewish. So that's what Zelda went out and found. She went out and looked for a Jew or a Chinese, to quote Harvey, which is interesting because you have the victim survivor. Obviously, she experienced quite a lot of abuse at work, sexual and otherwise, but you have the victim survivor playing into the predator's game, right? On one level, she believed him. Harvey had chewed out a whole string of assistants, fired them, raped them, whatever he did to them. They left the building sobbing, and she really needed someone to take her role so she could move on. Frankly, 4 years is a long time to be abused by a person. So, she wanted to do what it took to get somebody to successfully take her job. And so if it takes a Chinese or a Jewish person, that's the next person she's going to come up with. And that'll explain why I started in an office where everybody else was leggy, blonde and blue-eyed. So, but of course that's not true. It's not true that he doesn't touch Chinese women. I am testimony to that. So it's really interesting, I think, the circles of complicity that take place within a system of abuse. Because what happens there is, as the Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein case has proven, that women frequently become both the survivor of and the enabler of the abuser that they are working with.
When you chose to put your name to it, and be one of the leaders in this, what was your personal experience? Was the risk? Was there a reward with the risk?
Yeah. Well, I'm now aware that I, of course, skipped many steps. I've only talked about 98 and how we originally spoke out. But I think when I went to see Zelda, she was bound and determined to blow it open. And in some ways, I was so awed by her drive to social justice that I sort of went along. I mean, I was carried really along on a wave of, I think I basically was her tipping point. She'd had enough. She'd seen Harvey chew out all these women and she was like, it's got to stop. And I asked her afterwards, why I became the tipping point. And she was like, well, nobody came to me in tears before with a very clear account of what happened to them. So I think I was just simply the last straw in a string of women. And of course, I wasn't really aware of the string of women or anything that happened to them. So then Zelda and I embarked on essentially what we saw as a crusade, really, very much led by Zelda rather than myself, of how were we going to stop Harvey from doing this to other women. And so that is a road that really led us to find our own lawyers, to invoke constructive dismissal, to get propelled into negotiating a non-disclosure agreement in a big glass office at the Allen and Overy offices in the City of London. So that's all the bit that happened in 98, I think, was really driven by Zelda. And there's a comment now that the Me Too movement has exposed this whole story, where someone says, 20 years ago, I was in a room with Harvey's 2 assistants and one looked terrified and one looked angry. And I think that was really typified where we were. Zelda was furious and hell-bent on getting all this to stop. And I was completely terrified and just trailing along in her wake. So that was 98. But for better or worse, we both became part of this story that would then become this huge thing. And we didn't know that at the time. I think we had inklings that we needed to protect ourselves. We were worried that Harvey would set spies on us, which it turns out he did. You know, he employed former Israeli Mossad spies through a private agency called Black Cube to follow us around for years. And I do have documentation that, well, firstly, I've seen the file that Black Cube held on me these 20 years, and I also have emails from agents that we now know to be Black Cube agents approaching me and asking me for lunch and offering me, opportunities to further my career in film and various things like that. So I think there was a strong chance, even in 98, that A, we would be tracked for the rest of our lives to ensure compliance with the NDA, and B, in the worst case scenario, if we did not comply, I think there was a fear that something would happen to us. We didn't think that was beyond the grounds of possibility. So I actually went to a lawyer. You know, we've spoken a lot in this interview about my church background. I actually went to a person that Ellen and I know well, who was a lawyer at Chinese church, and told this person the account of everything that happened with Harvey Weinstein, including the fact that we were signing a non-disclosure agreement the next day and I'd never be able to speak of this again. And I said, please lock this in your law firm's vaults, because if anything happens to me, and by that I mean I'm wiped off the face of the earth, I accidentally fall under a bus, I want you to tell this story. I want you to bring this story out and tell it and give it to the press. So that's how it's no exaggeration to say we were afraid for our lives back then when we were 24 and 25. We were going up against forces that we could not measure, and that we were not sure how all that would end. So when we think about my so-called courage as a 24-year-old, on the one hand, yes, I was central to this process of trying to expose Harvey back in those days. And we went to talk to lawyers, we talked to senior people at Miramax. What we really wanted to do was go to the police, but we wanted it to be on record. Yes, we were courageous, but we were at the same time quite naive. We had no idea about how the legal system worked. We didn't realise how much we would be crushed. And so after 20 years of silence, was I then willing to talk to the New York Times journalist who came to doorstop my husband? Not on your Nelly. I was absolutely not willing. I was still not willing 20 years later to go completely public. And we've talked about the various, very, very complicated reasons, to do with Chinese culture, the sort of, stiff upper lip of immigrants, that you can't, as an immigrant, you're a guest in this country and you have to behave well. Faith, what happens to you affects the whole of your church family, and there's a lot of stigma around sex and rape and sexual assault. And I'm sure the church would have judged me as a person who brought it on myself. At the very least, they would have said, well, you went to work in the film industry. You're not a banker or a lawyer. Working in the film industry is akin to prostitution. And what were you wearing anyway? I thought that whole maybe you didn't pray enough line would be trotted out. So I didn't think there would be much comfort from... I thought there would be a lot of judgment from the faith-based side of things. And then, obviously, with my own family, I was very worried that my mother had always told me that anything you do, and this was about 6 at the time, anything you do reflects upon us as a family, but also reflects upon us as Chinese people. You're the only Chinese kid in your school. You're the only Chinese person who lives in this town. We're the only Chinese family that live on the street. And it's true that even from a very young age, I felt that everything I did something and somebody would say, oh, that's what Chinese people are like. Look at the smells coming from that house. That's the kind of food that Chinese people cook, as though we were all a complete monolith. So I think there were cultural, familial, and faith-based reasons for not speaking out, and not to mention economically and legally.
Yeah.
They tied us to an NDA with a settlement agreement, and there were many clauses in there about how he would sue us and destroy us. And, you know, if you're dealing with a multimillionaire and you have £1,000 in your bank account, you're not going to want to take that person on. Yeah. So, you know, there are lots and lots of reasons, from the very practical to the not practical. Over 2 years, how did I come to finally decide to speak out? The story went ahead in October 2017 with my name anonymous. At the beginning of 2019, so more than a year after the story was originally published, Zelda had been participating in a select committee at the House of Commons on workplace sexual assault, and she asked me whether I'd fly back to the UK to testify anonymously to this select committee on workplace sexual assault, which was chaired by Maria Miller, who's a Conservative MP, but also had Jess Brown as a Labour MP, a very outspoken Labour MP. I think all of these women are very, from both sides of the aisle, are pretty outspoken on, you know, women's issues and workplace issues. And Zelda had done so much for me in terms of originally speaking out for me and giving me the courage to kind of bring my case forward. I really didn't think, and she had never really asked me for anything, so I really didn't think this was something I could say no to, even though I thought the whole thing was completely terrifying. So I remember feeling completely vomitous and going to the House of Commons and going through the black rod doorway, secret doorway where people, you know, who were taken into the house on house business go. And I remember having this huge fight with the person at the door because I didn't want to give my name. I was known as Witness B, and everybody who goes in the House of Commons, you know, due to national security, has to produce an ID, and I wasn't willing to produce an ID. I was that worried that Harvey's spies were still out and that the story would be leaked to the press still. So anyway, I went in as Witness B, and I testified to this select committee. So it wasn't the full House of Commons, but a collection of MPs, not more than 10. And I remember sort of telling the story, much like I'm looking at your face right now. Often when I tell the story to someone who hasn't heard it at all, there's just horror. And I was looking at the face of these hardened MPs, and I was really talking about what it was like being at Miramax and what sort of workplace it was. Because at the time I was a British citizen employed at a London workplace. It might have been an American firm, but I was an employee in London. So this was something that concerned the House of Commons. And I remember thinking, wow, these hardened MPs, who I'm sure have heard all sorts of things, look pretty horrified. And I think at that point I really realised there's strength in this story. I didn't speak to the journalists to start with because I said to them, well, look, you've got Gwyneth Paltrow and Ashley Judd. You know, you have people who are trained and experienced Hollywood actresses who have a PR agency, and they have stylists and they have personal assistants. They have the apparatus of being a public figure behind them. You don't want my story. I don't mean anything. I'm an unknown name. Chinese people don't speak out about this kind of thing. It just felt like a huge reach. So I think that first step of sort of giving my testimony to MPs really woke me up to the idea that even though this is an ordinary person's story and that no one ever had heard of a person called Rowena Chiu, the story still had power. It wasn't a story that happened to Brad Pitt or Matt Damon or Gwyneth Paltrow, but it still had power as an ordinary person's story. A few months before that, speaking of Gwyneth Paltrow and Ashley Judd, I had been invited by Jodie Cantor and Megan Twohey, the two New York Times journalists who had originally broken the story, to attend a so-called gathering at Gwyneth Paltrow's house in the Hollywood Hills in Brentwood. And Gwyneth herself, obviously, as the host, was there, but Ashley Judd had also been invited, and clearly Jodie and Megan as the two journalists who put this together. And there was Rachel Crooks, who was a Trump accuser. There was an activist, person who had done some work on McDonald's labour laws. But also invited to be in the room was Christine Blasey Ford and the two lawyers that had flanked her as she'd given her testimony against Brett Kavanaugh being nominated to the Supreme Court. And it so happens that Christine Blasey Ford lives only a few blocks away or a short walk away from my house in Palo Alto. We both live in the suburbs of Palo Alto. Her kids had attended the same school that my kids attend. So in some ways, although she was by this time very much a public figure and really admired in America, she was also a local mum. She was not Gwyneth Paltrow or Ashley Judd. And to see her in the front room of Gwyneth Paltrow's house and to hear her tell her story, but also talk about how she's really just a soccer mum or a hockey mum. She's very much a sports mum, and she drives a battered minivan around Palo Alto and she teaches psychology. She seemed like such an ordinary person in the world of Hollywood actresses. And she was still able to tell her story and tell about the death threats and tell about moving out of her house and telling her of how her children had been pulled from school and all the terrible things that happened to her when she gave that testimony, but still kind of do it with a smile and still feel it was sort of worth it. I will say that meeting Dr. Ford, because she was an ordinary person, because she was from Palo Alto, because she had the story of huge weight that left ripples in a pond, it's like throwing a massive rock in a pond, all these ripples that she couldn't have told, I did think someone who is not Gwyneth Paltrow or Ashley Judd has done this and survived it. And so I think the combination of meeting Dr. Ford back in January and then doing the actual testimony as an anonymous witness B in April did shift my mindset about speaking out. Whereas previously I've been adamantly against the idea and intent on being anonymous for the rest of my life. I think that spring, where these couple of episodes happened, made me think a little bit differently about the possible power of telling my story. At that stage, in the process of the article and where the journalists were going with this, Jodie and Megan were on the cusp of publishing She Said, which was due to go to the printers over the summer of 2019. And so Jodie had kept in touch with me for the better part of almost 2 years to see whether I would one day be willing to speak out. I had lawyered up as soon as the original article came out, and I had basically a hotshot celebrity lawyer, Nancy Erica Smith, who was a lawyer in Gretchen Carlson's case against Fox News and got her the settlement of $25 million. And I wanted to hide behind a celebrity lawyer because I wasn't confident about my own ability to keep all of this at bay. Journalists, New York Times, spies, I mean, it all sounds crazy, right? So I got a celebrity lawyer, and Jodie kept in touch with my lawyer and called my lawyer every couple of weeks. Hey, how's Rowena doing? Do you think she's ready to speak? So it came to pass that in May of that year, after the experience with Dr. Ford, after the experience at the House of Commons, I very tentatively called Jodie, who I had kept at arm's length this whole time, when she was only allowed to contact my lawyer and not me, and said, I think I'm ready to talk. And I'm pretty sure Jodie almost fell off her chair because she had been trying for almost 2 years to get me to go on the record. And I said, and I remember she said to me, you have to be absolutely sure, because what we're going to do is we're going to hold the book from going to print and we're going to insert your story into it. But once you give me your story and you agree to be inserted in the book, we can't keep pulling it off the shelves. So I said, yes, I think I'm very sure. So this was May. We did a series of interviews through July and August. They rewrote various chapters of the book to feature me. And then on September the 9th, I went live on the Today Show in front of 4 million people. And that was the journey to speaking out.
Thanks. What would you, when someone and some people are feeling desperately alone at the moment, you said you receive through Me Too things, through the places that you speak at. What do you say to people when they're saying, I'm feeling desperately alone here?
Yeah.
And then let's finish. But what wisdom through an experience do you sort of draw on?
Yeah. I think first of all you feel desperately alone. Before I did agree to speak out, I in some ways was locked in my own prison of isolation. My book agent likes to call my story as being in 3 separate arcs. There's Silent, which is what Harvey imposed on Zelda and I from the original assault in 98 all the way through to the journalists coming. That long period of history between 98 and 2017 is classified as silence because we weren't able to speak out at all. And that was obviously a very long period of time and very isolating. Then there was a period of 2 years between 2017 and 2019 when I chose not to speak out. My story was out there, but my name wasn't. And my agent likes to call that bit private because I was really coming to terms with myself, with my story and what I was going to do. And then, of course, from 2019 onwards, when I first did this explosive interview on NBC and then wrote the op-ed less than a month later, there was no chance of anonymity after that. I have testified at the State of the Union, I've testified in the House of Commons, I've been on NBC, CBS, Australian Broadcasting Corporation, BBC many times. It's wild, the amount of media attention. I think I've done over 1,000 media interviews, so the amount of media attention the Weinstein story received is crazy. So it's really interesting because there's silent, private and public, and then during silent and also during private, really, you do feel very alone. Silent is, of course, the most awful condition of all because I couldn't even talk to my own husband and didn't. Private is a little bit better because, and many survivors choose to stay in that state because you get to control who you tell the story to. And it might be very few people, but it's people who are trusted. And that's not the same as being public where your story's gone and you have no control over it. So what I would say to people who feel very alone, if you're still in silent, you have elected to be there. I know that feels really hard because the price of telling your story is incredibly painful. But I would say choose one person that you trust and let them into your circle of privilege so that you move from silent to private. And it can just be one tiny baby step. Now, the proviso I would place on that is, as I've already said in this segment, sometimes the person that will believe you is tragically not the person that you think would or should. And so that's really difficult. And so I always say, often people talk to me or they email me through an anonymous email address and they say, I want you to be the first person I talk to, but I'm not going to tell you my name. And I'm like, well, that's totally fair, because that's what I did to the New York Times. And I will always say to that person, first and foremost, I believe you. Because it's probably the first time they've ever heard that. Because they haven't been able to share this experience with anyone, they've probably never heard the words, well, I believe you, I absolutely believe everything that's happened to you. So I think if you are an ally, as we talked about earlier, the most important thing you can say to a sexual assault survivor is, I believe you. Start there. Because you'd be amazed that that simple thing is probably not something they've heard. And then secondarily, and only secondarily, and it doesn't have to be the same day or even the same week or even the same year, you can ask that person, do you feel ready to share with someone that you trust in your life? To think about one person that you trust. Because so it doesn't have to be going to the police or going to the courts or going to the media. It could just be find a trusted person. And unfortunately, if the person you first talked to doesn't turn out to be the person you thought they were, try somebody else. Because I think it's really important to have one person in your circle of confidence. That's the only way you can stop feeling so alone about it. The thing is, in theory, if you're a sexual assault survivor, you know from everything you read about the Me Too movement on the internet that you're not alone. In your head, you know there are thousands of people, tens of thousands of people, obviously, because the Me Too movement couldn't have existed without that, right? But in your heart, you will always feel completely alone. And so that's why these steps are really important. They are the whole step about believe yourself first and foremost. Think of a person you trust. Try that person. They may disappoint you and be ready for that. And be willing to do it again with somebody else. and keep going until you find that one person, because that one person, hopefully, if they're a good person, will be a source of huge comfort to you. And take it in those steps. Don't, because often I get asked by desperate people, especially if they're the survivor of somebody very famous, how do I do it? How do I go to the press? And I'm like, hold on a minute. Let's start with one person that you trust. We don't start with thinking, how do I go to the press? Because it's too much. It's too overwhelming. Take it at your own pace. And with each step, if you then want to stop there, you have every right to. It's your story. It doesn't belong to anyone else. You don't owe the world it. So you may have come to speak to me anonymously, and that's absolutely fair. You own your own privacy. Now, if you feel ready for the next step, you go find that one person you trust, and obviously that one person you trust knows your name, and that's another big step. But with each step, you can stop there. You can have spoken to me anonymously, and that feels enough because you've put your story on the record in some way. Or you've spoken to one person, that feels enough. And then just wait until you're ready. Lots of people pushed me over 2 years to come out before I was ready, and I wasn't ready, and I took the time that I needed. And I get really funny feedback on that, because some people are like, how come it took you 2 whole years? And I'm always, how come it only took me 2 years? I feel like 2 years to think about coming out with a 20-year secret is actually a relatively small amount of time. So I always say to sexual assault survivors that are really hesitant about speaking out, give yourself much more time than you think you'll need. Like, think about how long you think you'll need, and then double that, maybe even quadruple it. Because I think much, much better to take longer and to be ready than to rush speaking out and not find the words you want, not honour your own story, or misplace your trust in someone who's going to react negatively and then re-traumatise you. You know, those are big risks. So we're back to, overall, I think it is worth speaking out for the value to yourself and to the community within which you operate. But there's no question, though, that the price is high. So all of these things have to be considered. The true cost of speaking out must be considered in conjunction with, is it worth it for me in my circumstances to do this?
Well, you challenged me for my mission.
I think the mission is incredible.
Yeah.
I think this idea of telling these untold stories is really important. I think you mustn't underestimate what you do and the power of these YouTube videos. You know, you spoke a lot about how you didn't get the feedback you expected. And I think that's very parallel to, you can tell your sexual assault story to somebody and they may or may not believe you, but that's not why you do it. And the other thing is that actually you don't know the impact of your YouTube videos on somebody who doesn't know you and who doesn't comment on the thread, but they might watch it and it might change their life in some way, and you might never meet that person, but you will have changed the trajectory of where they are and what they're doing.
And I think the way that you're speaking, it's not just me making YouTube videos, it's for each of us that are listening. What is it?
Yeah.
What's the thing?
Yep.
Yeah, thanks. And thank you for putting your name to it.
Yeah, of course.
Thanks ever so much for watching and making it to the end. Please do consider subscribing, becoming a member, hyping this video. And really, if you are feeling anything where you're like, yeah, Rowena, what you've been saying is amazing, then please do consider coming to the event in September. Thanks ever so much for watching and being part of this.